this session is at least partially motivated by some of the discussions some of the branches have had on ethics in economics, and in particular about whether or not we should introduce a kind of a code of ethics for economists. I just want to make the point that, of course, economists do not operate in a ethics vacuum, right? So when I'm a professor at the University of Queensland, and I have the university has a code of conduct. When I undertake research, there is also a responsible conduct of research code, which is essentially set up by the Australian Research Council. I'm the deputy chair of the Queensland Competition Authority, and as such, I'm subject to the Queensland Public Sector Ethics Act. So, we don't live in an ethics vacuum. I think Ross, I'm sure, is subject to, as a journalist, also to code of conduct. Many economists in the private sector are subject to codes of conduct that are internal. Or, for example, if you are an expert witness in a legal proceeding, there's some guidance and a code of conduct as well. So, if you don't live in a vacuum in terms of ethics, why is that we need a code of conduct? And I think I'm pretty sure that we're going to have to listen to some very interesting arguments why we should have one. I just want to make a sort of a quick, really remark, and I think for me, and that's what motivated me to start this discussion within our branch, is that it's really, for me, the code of conduct is to signal or to indicate to the public at large, but also economists themselves, that we collectively understand that we have a special responsibility, right? I mean, the actions that we take as economists can and often do have an impact on other people's lives, right? And somehow, we have to make sure that the public understands this, but that our students understand this, that our colleagues understand this. So I think I'm convinced that that's the way to go. And I mean, more broadly, I worried about the kind of called deterioration, if you like, of the public's perception of economists. I think Rod Sims today was saying, the economics is the language of public policy. And I'm afraid that maybe economics was the language of public policy, so or soon is not going to be the language of public policy. And I think it's going to come to no surprise to you that I think that's a loss for society, right? Because we don't know the truth, but we do have good insights, right? And more often than not, we stop stupid stuff happening, right? And that also, you don't get any credit, right, for stopping bad stuff. And sometimes you do get nicknames. For example, I overheard someone calling me Dr. No behind my back, but I was okay. I think that's kind of a role that economists do and should do. And I think frankly, I think we live in a very strange sort of setting where I don't think economics has ever been more useful, right? So new techniques, I look at the people we hire, young economists, early career economists, new techniques, new concepts, new ideas, really kind of pushing the envelope. Now we know how to evaluate policy, right? It was such a big deal, 20 years ago or so, no one knew how to do it. Now we actually have, the techniques and tools and so on. Personally, I could be, if I wanted to, I work 24/7. The demand for what I do is very high. But on the other hand, I've been an economist now for a long time. In terms of public perception, I think this is the lowest, right? The lowest I've ever seen. And I think, like I said, it's a kind of a bad thing. I think a code of ethics, it's a small step, okay? I don't think it's a I think the other things we should do, of course, but I think is the principled thing to do, right? I think we should sort of pursue. So on that note, let me introduce our first speaker, who I think is going to talk a bit more. He's going to put some meat into what I've just said, and who kind of articulate, I think, what a code of ethics might, some ideas of what might look like. And this is the president of the New South Wales branch, who is also a consulting economist and also the organizer of this wonderful conference. So he should please take the floor. Thank you. And 15 minutes.
Sure. Thank you, Flavio. So I'll put up. I do have a little slideshow, and I sort of debated whether I do a little slides because if I can even work the mouse, I can't see how to work the mouse. Oh, there we go. Yeah, beautiful. Here we go. So first thing, by the way, I do work for a consulting firm, and I realised I'm actually meant to be representing the New South Wales branch of the Economic Society here, or at least the Economic Society. Well, that's how I positioned myself when I was doing this. But I realised I put these on my firm slides. But on the other hand, I guess that's not... yes, transparency, thank you. And also it's not entirely inappropriate in that it is sort of suggesting I am an economics consultant, and this is where a lot of some of the issues lie. So the other thing I just wanted to say at the start, this has been an issue that's been high on our minds for quite some time. There was things being put in the press quite some time ago, and I think I actually promised to Ross a couple of years ago that I would do something in the next year, and of course that didn't happen. So finally got the chance to do this here. And as soon as we get through this conference, I will try to make a commitment to make sure we do make some action on this. So anyway, here's my thoughts around a code of conduct for economists. So first of all, some matters of scope. We're focusing on matters particular to economics, excluding matters that are common with other disciplines. So there is lots of ethics matters in research that economists do, but that's pretty much common with a lot of other disciplines. So, and they're covered by existing codes. So I'm going to focus on what is, and what I think a code for economists needs to focus on is what is particular about economics, which is really, what is it? Well, economists study how society allocates resources. We like to think we can influence policy. I was a lot more confident about that before I spoke to Tony. And which a policy that affects the lives of a great many. So I feel, as Flavio says, we have a responsibility. And there's some big risk factors. Pretty much all policy and any analysis of policy is really about thinking about what's going to happen in the future, which of course is, all the quotes sort of say predictions are difficult, particularly about the future. All those challenges is that ultimately the future involves judgment. It's really difficult to be proven wrong, unlike sort of the auditor. We can make predictions about what's going to happen in sort of 10 years' time. Well, hey, I've got 10 years before anyone can prove me wrong, and then they're going to have some difficulty. Then we get into some potential sources of bias. Often our interests don't align. We're paid by a client. There are other sort of more subtle influences we have. And economists, like others, suffer from biases. And I think one of the biggest ones is confirmation bias. Anyway. Next question, what is an economist? Now, perhaps I'm a bit defensive, but I see a lot of this stuff in the press and, it's generally having a crack at the consultants. And I sort of think this issue's broader. So what I think is of this purpose, what's the criteria I'd want to involve? Well, first of all, advising on the best use of scarce resources, because that's basically the economic problem. Secondly, we're claiming either explicitly or implicitly some sort of level of expertise. And thirdly, we're attempting to influence. And if it's not one of these three, then I don't really care, I figure, that what this code applies to. So then who would this actually apply to? Well, I think immediately consultants, and if we were to do a code, immediately I think consultants and academics. So Flavio, you and me were in. Then I think sort of more broadly, well, public service economists. And this is where I do see a lot of issues where Yeah, it's not potentially we're getting issues around sort of independence and objectivity that are popping into there. Should we, public sector economists, sign some sort of code? And then we even go broader. Journalists, think tanks. Can you imagine think tanks sort of subscribing to a code, and even some politicians fit into this? Certainly on the first and the third, and a few politicians certainly would be in the middle, claiming explicitly or implicitly expertise in how we should allocate resources. So, to what extent should we actually put what scope should this code cover? Have we got a problem? My opinion, absolutely yes, and two broad reasons. One, we certainly have a public perception problem, and that is of great concern. But secondly, in my experience in seeing variety of analysis, I'm just shaking my head, horrified. How could that possibly have been done? And I sort of think there is no way that could have been done free of bias. So there's mistrust, issues with economic analyses, and this is, I guess, the third one that I sort of pick up, and perhaps this is my little bias coming through. I see examples of seemingly incredibly unwanted confidence in opinion. And by the way, I just want to throw in a kind of an example on this. You're probably aware of, Are We Objective? You're probably aware of the ESA National Economic Panel of Experts. And if you're not, then you should be. It's a great, fun source to see what's actually some of the debates and what some prominent economists think about the debates. But what happens is I think we've got 50 economists in that sort of range. Yeah. And they pose a question. So, which actually, Flavia, can you give me an example of a recent question? Or?
Whether or not for-profit having the latest.
Yeah.
So it's not advertised yet, but I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure.
For-profit, whether for-profit health and education lead to good outcomes.
Right. Yeah. Okay, and then someone like Flavia, who's on the panel, would be asked to say whether you strongly disagree, or strongly agree, or in between, and then also rate their level of certainty about their choice. So this is the kind of results we get. On pretty much every question, we get strong differing opinions, and the confidence typically follows this U-shaped pattern, where we get a bunch who are strongly disagree with very, very high confidence, and a bunch who strongly agree with very, very high confidence. And the people who just disagree or agree or are kind of uncertain or are in the middle, their level of confidence is way lower. And how is it that the best economists in our land are actually having completely diametric views? And it really is, to my mind, an issue of objectivity. Would a code of conduct help? There's quite a bit of discussion in the literature around the world around this. Views appear to be mixed. My view, and I believe this is a few others, is what's the downside if it's a voluntary code? And I think basically in my discussions with other people who effectively do sign up to do legal work, and they have to sign that they have read the declaration that their duty is to the court, for instance, they take that seriously, and I suspect a code would as well. So my sort of view, it should. How would it work? I sort of think it'd take the impression, the view, if we had a voluntary code, I imagine if I'm sort of writing a report, I would actually just put in a note in the very, very beginning of the report saying, in writing this report, I've adhered to the Code of Conduct for Economists. And then I believe I should be challenged on that by others who have also adhered to the Code of Conduct. Voluntary code, process for code breaches, investigation by a subcommittee, for example. I think that's all sort of doable. What a content might look like, I think, in my mind, the key words have got to be around integrity, objectivity, and independence. Basically, independence, we declare, we make sure we're free of sort of any financial interest, and by the way, that can be to my mind, very, very subtle. Objectivity, I'm big on this. I find is the biggest issue, and then integrity, which is around the honesty. Obviously, there should be a level of competence there. To my mind, that tends not to be the biggest issue. Transparency, to my mind, is huge. I feel like if we're a code of conduct, I would like to be able to say that if I haven't put it in the report, I'm willing to share it, if of course within sort of reason, to somebody else who signed up to the code of conduct for critique. Then there's all the other sort of usual suspects, things around respect and other little matters that sort of come in there, which I think are sort of common with a lot of other codes. Then there's a few little special circumstances. What happens if someone asks, say, hires my firm explicitly to help lobby for a particular thing? Then I think we're in sort of a situation where I'm sort of doing the work for them and possibly, not working in the public interest. But at what point do you, stop selling pens to the bad guys? So there is some sort of issues there. By the way, fortunately, I've never really had to be in that situation. Okay, so where to from here? Very keen to get what people's thoughts are. View, thoughts, would you sign up for such a code? And are you interested in providing input? So I'm going to sort of hand over, but actually, can I just get a quick show of hands? Would you sign up for a code if we had one? On the lines of that I've done. Yeah, just basically sign up for code which basically had that list. Or imagine a one-pager. Okay. And that's it for me at this stage.
So what I do is I just kind of like to run these things as a kind of quasi-democracy. But is it okay if we leave it after the last presentation to open up for questions and comments? All right, cool. Right, our second speaker is someone who I think most of us, or if not all of us, will read, I think, more regularly than we read the American Economic Review. And I'm sure he will also have some very interesting observations on ethics in economics, and that is Ross Gittins, who is the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. Can you please welcome him? Thank you.
Well, the main point I want to make, and the main reason I was so easily enticed to be on this panel today, even though it's my busiest day of the week, is that if ever there was a part of the economics profession where behaviour seems most in need of ethical standards, it must surely be the relatively new industry of economic consultancy. Economists who make their living providing economic analysis, usually in the form of econometric modelling, to paying customers, usually industry groups lobbying the government for or against some policy proposal, but occasionally the government itself. Sometimes I think economic consulting is little more than the upmarket end of the public relations industry. I suppose there must be occasions where these consultants provide their clients with an analysis purely for their use internally. But for the most part, the analysis is sought so that it can be made public, complete with oversimplified press release, in order to influence public opinion and put pressure on the government. Often the attempt is made to give this analysis greater authority and credibility by calling it independent analysis. I can't remember ever hearing the economists who produced that analysis contradicting that claim, even if they don't make it themselves. But nor can I imagine how anyone who believes in the power of market forces could believe that analysis that's the product of a commercial transaction where the producer is hoping the paying customer is pleased with what they paid for and will make repeat orders, where I can't see how anyone who believes in market forces could also believe that such advice is in any way independent. Is it the behaviour of an independent authority to keep its mouth tightly buttoned while your client and the politicians who agree with that cause repeatedly misrepresent your findings to the public? Is that being independent? This lack of independence is just as much the case when Treasury or some other department is commissioning analysis on behalf of the government. Sometimes the government may be genuinely uncertain and in need of external advice, particularly since they have reaped many efficiency dividends by getting rid of their policy advisors. But sometimes the government may genuinely be in need of external advice, but it's far more likely it's after modelling intended to help it persuade the public and the Senate that the policy it's determined to introduce should be accepted. In such transactions, Treasury knows what policies it favours, it knows what the government wants to be told, and it has a fair idea which consultants will be more amenable to giving it and its political masters the advice they're hoping for. Forum shopping is a vice not limited to lawyers. Why do you think successive governments have refused to allow the Productivity Commission to analyse the costs and benefits of the so-called free trade agreements that they make? Well, I'll tell you if the idea hasn't occurred to you. They know, the governments know, that the trouble with the Productivity Commission is that it really does consider itself independent, and it may well not give the government the answer it was hoping for. So guess what? It doesn't get the commission. You don't need to be a modeller to know how easy it is for the modeller to get the results desired by the choice of model used and by tweaking the variables. And yet the results are so often presented to the public as though they were God's immutable truth. There's no accompanying acknowledgement of the chosen model's strengths and weaknesses, no admission of the key variables that are driving the model's results, no sensitivity analysis, no admission that the model is a combination of both empirically measured variables and mere economic theories about how the variables combine to produce the model's much touted results. No admission that exogenous variables for the future are set quite subjectively. No admission that many economists would disagree with the particular theories underlying the model you used. Wouldn't want to tell the punters that. They might think there was some doubt about the immutability of our findings and recommendations. Sometimes cannier modellers seek to ensure themselves against criticism such as these by burying in the very fine print of their reports jargon-ridden acknowledgements of some of them. But they stay mute when their results are presented and debated in a way that makes clear these insurance clauses haven't been read by the very people who should have read them, as was always intended that they did not. Is this ethical behaviour? Does caveat emptor make it all okay? But I suspect there's a related, less commercially driven reason why the use of economic modelling in the public policy debate is more about bamboozling non-economists than enlightening them. The other explanation is that consciously or unconsciously, economists seek to avoid the Wizard of Oz moment, when we see behind the curtain and realise the powerful wizard is really just a little man shouting into a megaphone, using tricks to make out he knows a lot more than he actually does. Consider just two examples. Although many economists bang on endlessly about the adverse incentive effects of high marginal tax rates, we purport to show the effects of a major tax reform using a model that can represent income tax only as a flat tax, flat rate tax. Why? Because the model has just a single representative household, which obviously can't face multiple marginal tax rates. We use a model utterly inadequate to the task because it's the best we've got, and present the results as definitive without any upfront admission that we don't have the tools to answer the question we've been asked. Or take the very common modelling practice of assuming a short-term Keynesian world and a long-term neoclassical world. And by the way, when I said that the cannier modellers take out insurance by ensuring that there's up the back there is some words that, using a lot of jargon, admit to some of the model's weaknesses, an example of how you would make sure the punters didn't actually get the message is just to say that, like most models of this kind, it has a Keynesian short term and a neoclassical long term. If you know a punter who can figure out what that means, he's a pretty smart punter. At any rate, we know that many of the macroeconomic, dynamic, stochastic, what's his names, are built on that basis. We asked such a model to tell us the long-term economic cost of introducing the carbon pollution reduction scheme. It starts in equilibrium, introduces the disturbance of the CPRS, the line wobbles a bit, then starts on its inexorable journey back to long-term equilibrium. Then we announce to the punters that our modelling shows the scheme's long-term cost in foregone economic growth is, fortunately, quite minor. Then we wonder why they don't trust us. They say forecasters have a lot to be modest about. I'd add that they have a lot to be more ethical about.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I have some interesting examples of modeling taking, but we'll come back to that later. Look, our final speaker is someone who whose name I've heard many, many times. He probably doesn't realize that, but always in very favorable terms, which is not a small, not a small feat, I think, nowadays. And he's Tony Harris, who is a former commissioner of the old Industry Commission, now the Productivity Commission, and also former New South Wales Auditor General. So can you please welcome Tony Harris? Thank you.
Thank you very much. When I first saw the title of this session some months ago, I thought we were all going to be budding theologians because there's not many in the community who who enforce ethical behaviour. You know, we enforce the law and we enforce theology. Well, the churches try to enforce theology, but there's no one in the middle that talks about ethics very much. There's certainly no institutional drivers for ethical behaviour. And when you think about it, there's not very many professions, and I would say least of all is the economics profession an example, where there are no problems about ethical behaviour. You know, doctors over-servicing, dentists over-servicing, nurses fudging the figures, police fudging the figures. You can go through every profession, or at least I do, and I think, my goodness, that's a problem. And I wish we could do something about that
Except
problem.
for journalists, Tony.
Except for journalists who write for Fairfax. Certainly those who write for Murdoch, I have problems with. And then I look at I used to be an economist. I joined the Economic Society first nearly 50 years ago. You'll be surprised to know from looking at me. But I was also involved in auditing. Now, auditing is one of the most regulated professions around. You know, not only must you get yourself a degree or so from a university who's accredited, you must also pass the exams for the CPA or the chartered accountants. You must then get yourself registered if you're doing publicly listed firms, registered with ASIC, and ASIC is meant to monitor your behaviour. And ASIC gives you some protections. For example, the auditee can't fire the auditor without getting ASIC's permission. And you think, well, that's pretty good, you know, I can't be fired. And indeed, they don't fire you. They merely, well, it's about time we had a tender for the audit job. You know, I don't like that last answer, so I'm thinking about having a tender. And of course, Bond, those of you who remember Alan Bond in his famous days, he would appoint the external auditor on the basis of how well he answered questions about Bond's manipulation of financial data. Arthur Anderson won that one. And auditors used to audit my work. And every 7 years, an auditor is meant to come into the office and look at the whole office. And during one of the tenders, the audit firm came in and said to the Public Accounts Committee, who was the client, said to the Public Accounts Committee, well, what answer do you want? Because, you know, we can deliver that. Just tell us what it is that you want. And I was forever grateful that one of the still existing 4 major firms wasn't awarded that tender. Somebody who was a bit more objective was. So even if an auditor who can't be fired and has gone through all this practice, and it's a problem, as we've discussed before, of independence, we've heard that word already, and I don't use that word lightly, I don't use it much at all. There are very few people who are independent. Maybe the Pope, you know, you've got to kill him. You can't vote him out. Auditors General are really hard to get rid of. The only people that have got rid of them was Marcos, Hitler, and the President of Samoa. When the Auditor General criticised the President for corruption, he was also dismissed. Very, very difficult to dismiss an Auditor General. But independence is not a word that I would apply to most entities or most people. I call them external advice, if you want, but not independent advice. So, with all these worries, what do I do about economists? I've come from the public sphere, of course, working in Treasury and Treasury-related entities for most of my working life. And I used to say, and used to argue, that Treasury was almost incorruptible because the Treasurer was the kind of person who could make arguments against the policy minister of the day. Minister for Finance, similarly, is very well placed. In fact, it's his job to make arguments against the policy minister of the day. And I thought that these two entities were the best entities to work for. Unfortunately, even in that arena, we have seen it gone. And I suppose you can trace it back to Howard days. You won't remember that a person called the head of the Department of Defence, Paul Barrett AO, was fired by the Minister for Defence, Mr. Moore. The reason that he was fired is because he insisted that Mr. Moore receive advice. I think it was on the submarines, advice on the Collins-class submarines. He and the Chief of Defence Forces wrote advice and sent it over to the Minister's office, and it was returned, Minister not read. Okay, the Minister doesn't want to know about this. And they said, well, the Minister does want to know. It's his job, you know, and it's our job to tell him. So the two of them walked across with the minute and gave it to the Minister, so the Minister could no longer claim that he had not read the advice. And shortly after, Paul Barrett was fired. It went to the federal court, and the federal court judge, Justice Anthony, said politicians can select people on political grounds. We've got an apolitical public service enshrined in legislation, and the judge said yes. Well, ministers can select secretaries of departments for political reasons. So that may have been the start of this almost sudden reduction of power that the public servants had in providing frank and fearless advice. And I remember Dr. Peter Shergold, the head of the Prime Minister's Department, saying it was balderdash. Anybody who said that they don't provide frank and fearless advice, that's balderdash. And I thought, well, that's an interesting word. And just a few years later, Peter Shergold had to write a report which admitted that the degree of frank and fearless advice being provided had diminished quite significantly. I remember in my time, I was asked, it was a surprise actually, the Minister said, oh, the Prime Minister wants X. And I gave some awful response that today would have led me to be fired. But in those days, you could actually provide that kind of advice, even if you were intemperate occasionally. These days, one of the questions that they don't ask at interview is, how do you provide unwanted advice to the Minister? They don't ask it because you don't do it. There's no way of doing it. And it's not only in the public sector, it's also in the private sector. I remember my son telling me a story about a firm that for which he once worked, and on a fairly crucial risk assessment by the credit agencies, they'd made a significant mistake in the company's favour. And he said to the risk manager, look at this mistake, what are we going to do? And the risk manager said, oh, look, I'll look after this. Meaning, I'm not going to do anything. Why should I do anything? Because it's in our favour. So it's not only in the public sector that we find this kind of issue. Now, how to fix it? I don't know the answer to that. I think transparency is important. We were doing a report on the sale of the Bank of New South Wales. Should we or should we not sell it? Basically a straight economic question. And I decided that the best way to handle this was to have the consulting firm helping me publish everything that we could about that issue, because if their work was puerile, then they would suffer the reputational consequences. If it was robust, then they would have the reputational benefits of that advice. So transparency is always, to me, quite important. And I would like more involvement of the economic profession in this argument. Too many academics, still today, will see very important subjects being aired in the public, but they won't contribute to it in any public way. Conversation, the publication by United Universities called Conversation, is helping remediate that. But for example, tollways in Sydney, now a fantastic subject. It's getting press coverage every day now. And where are the academics talking about this issue, about allowing private firms to carry risks that they are not able to carry as well as the public, about the network implications of roadworks and the idiocy of having part of the network charged and part of the network not charged? Where are the academics involved in this argument? They're not there. So more involvement from economists in public arenas, more transparency about the issues that we're looking at are two steps. And I think, as I indicate, I think I would vote for a code of conduct as well. In fact, I would like police and nurses and public servants and others to have an exposure to an authority other than their employer. I would like them to have a conflict between doing what the employer wants and doing what the profession wants. So at least they have that conflict in their brain at the time they're signing off a report. So it's a little step, perhaps, that we're talking about today, but as Mao once said, little steps eventually get you there. Thanks.
Look, some very interesting, I think, observations. I think we're kind of all in agreement that is a small step, right? And number one. Number two is that that's certainly not, the issue of ethics and conduct more broadly is not specific to economists, but economists do have a special, they do play a special role in public policy. So I think that's, in some sense, it's above and beyond many other professions. And so I really like the notion of having this potential conflict between what your employer tells you to do and what an outside, you use the word independent, organization tells you to do. I think that these are all good. I'll just make another observation, which is I think transparency is really key. And I sympathize with sort of Ross's sort of point about you read and let me say CG, computable generic equilibrium does, it's like cost benefit analysis, it's fine, but there are other techniques. For example, we have instead of using simulation or computation, using these parameters that some are estimated and some are just and then there's a very small footnote, usually not even the first page 4 or 5, and you need to be an expert to understand the footnote anyway. We can actually estimate. We have access. We have the tax data, and we have now the techniques to and brain power and the computer power to actually do that. So I think we are in that. That's why I talked about before. We're in kind of very strange. We have this, but we don't use it. And if you did, and in fact, if you look at the top journals now, look at the Economic Record, which is our journal. If you want to publish an empirical paper, you need to make available the data, right? And so people can replicate. I think the incentives are still wrong because, for example, you don't get any prizes for duplicating someone's, or not. If you can't, you don't get any prizes for that. And there's no avenue rather than maybe a blog or, a letter to the editor or whatever so maybe journals could have a session on studies that you cannot replicate. I can see from where I sit that automatically that's going to change the incentives, right? If you have a session in a journal saying studies that are not replicable, right? You don't want to be in that session, right? Not as one who wrote a study that. So I think there are lots of other small steps that we can take, and I think I just want you to think about sort of the code of conduct as being one small, but perhaps more importantly allows us to think a bit more deeply about what we do and the responsibilities that we have. And just a quick example on Ross's sort of a point about the study. So I looked at one, and I won't say the name of the company, but you can do a Google search later, where we're comparing the cost savings for the government of moving from cost plus, essentially, a cost plus type of procurement to a fixed price, right? So instead of hiring someone and pay them according to the tasks they do by the invoices that they send you per hour, a fixed price. And they had a 20%, like $2 billion worth of savings for the government. Now, I work in this my whole life, and I can tell you, and I've given advice, I've looked at numbers, in Australia, in you name, over many different countries, and I can tell you this is not true. Okay? And why is not true? For a very simple reason. A fixed price contract gets renegotiated. Okay? So that's very simple. But it took me kind of about 2 hours, And on page, whatever, 80 of a 200-page report, I finally got the answer I wanted. So they looked at some studies that indicated that there was a 20% savings. And then they plugged that number into the CG modeling, and then the CG modeling did its thing, which is valid, to work out if there is a cost saving of 20%, what's the benefit to society, because then suddenly we have more money, money goes to more efficient industries, blah, 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 right? But, but really the 20% is out of, completely made up, right? And so I think that's kind of the, this should be on page 1, on bold letters, not really, so this would be, for me, would be a breach of the code, I mean, if it's on page 1 on bold letters, say we assume that's 20%, and all we do is calculate the, the general equilibrium impact of a 20% savings, I will have no problem with that, right? Based on all these parameters, that's fine. But that wasn't the case. Anyway, enough said. Now I'm very happy to open for questions or comments. I think there is a roving microphone, and if you just put your hand up, can I just ask you to say your name and the organization you work for?
I'm just going to, if that's all right, I'm going to take the power of the microphone that I wielded and start it off. So I think we could all agree that corruption and breaking ethics is a human nature problem. And Ross touched on it, and Richard also did. So Ross, in the fact that as economists sometimes we bamboozle non-economists, has it been investigated, especially as we talk about a possible code of conduct for ESA, about trying to collaborate with other disciplines who are not economists in order to try to bring in, one, a mutual understanding in that, what we think might be right is understandable to others, and also to kind of allow for a bit more input. And if that question makes sense, has it been considered in how we can collaborate with other disciplines in considering to, I guess, increase the ethics?
We thought about asking the CPA, but we didn't change our mind. But anyway, so
I can try to respond.
Yeah, go.
Yes, so thank you. So in doing my background research for this, I've looked at an awful lot of codes of conduct. Economics is special, it is different, and there's an awful lot in other codes of conduct where you just think, well, that's just really a bit superfluous. So I don't think, I like to think economists are special, and so I think and
Everybody thinks they're special. I spend my life attacking professions that think they're special.
And well, what makes us different? Yeah, makes us special. And I think we are. Yeah. And we are, well, put it another way, we're different. And the look at the codes. So could we have a shared code? We will plagiarise, benefit from other codes, but I don't think there's a value in actually having effectively a joint code.
But if I can, but certainly we could elevate ethics, and in doing so, for example, having the Allied Social Science meetings in the US, there's no reason why there couldn't be a special session on ethics across social sciences, for example, and that's a small steps again, right?
One way to reframe the question is, if the Economic Society ever got to the point of drafting an ethical code, could they show that to a bunch of non-economists and ask them if they thought it made sense?
That's a good.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm kind of getting at. Are you able to do something that goes, yeah, does this make sense? Does it sound reasonable to someone who's not in the discipline?
One of the issues that we have as a problem, I think, is the fact that everybody's an economist, or anybody's an economist. Not everybody's a nurse or a lawyer or a doctor or an architect because they have to belong to an association, make payments, be recognised and listed. Not everyone can be an auditor. But anybody can be an economist, and with an economic society, with an economics group putting out a code of conduct is fine, but will people know to whom it applies?
Well, I think that's an interesting point. As you'd expect of economists, they haven't gone to the government and say, what we think the community really, really needs is for you to license economists so that all those shonky economists don't steal our business. All the other professions have done that. We haven't. And so membership of the Economic Society, you don't have to prove that you have passed enough courses to be made a member. So there is an issue, I think, in saying if you have a code of conduct, how do you define the people to whom it refers?
Which, to answer that, one of the reasons I put that criteria of claiming explicitly or implicitly some sort of level of expertise, and I think that's gets down to that. And by the way, I think there is that problem to picking up on your point, is like, if you were to trip over and needed help, I'd come to your aid. Would I claim expertise at that point? And if you were in real trouble, I'd say, oh no, I'm not there. I don't have capability.
No, if you're in real trouble and you had the expertise, you'd run like mad.
Yeah. But if there is an incredibly difficult policy issue and thousands of lives depend on this policy issue, I don't have the expertise. Oh yeah, sure, I'll make a comment. Sure, I've got an opinion on that. It's an incredible thing where people are quite, when one life is at stake and clearly there's medical expertise required, where people will back away. Where many lives are at stake and people don't have the expertise, they will jump right in and have a very strong opinion. So it's an issue.
I think what sort of we envisage is something like it's voluntary anyway, and so hopefully, as you write a paper or a report or a I have actually written on toll roads and PPPs and stuff, and for the conversation but other outlets as well, and have a I subscribe to the code of conduct of economists. So I think that's kind of what we have in mind, isn't that sort of? And the market will work in some sense.
One of the issues for a code of conduct is the thing that the Conversation website really reminds us of, and that is, do you state explicitly any potential conflicts of interest?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it should be.
Yes.
I can ask now. So yeah, as a public servant, sorry, Felix Carmel here. I am, I did have to agree to the code of conduct for my particular organisation, and I know that there are consequences if I don't meet that code of conduct. The issue I see with some of these voluntary codes is that there is no real consequence to follow it. It's voluntary. You said, Richard, that we'd launch investigations, but what's the actual consequence of breaching this code?
Good question.
Yeah. In other words, if you're not careful, you create a situation where somebody who's not particularly ethical can gain a bit of kudos with the public by saying, I've signed the pledge.
Yes. Good question. And of course, in other professions, they are meant to exclude the person from the association when there was a serious breach or impose some other penalty, exclusion being the ultimate penalty that they apply.
Which the Economic Society could do. I guess it doesn't fit very easily with the code being voluntary, but if the Economic Society had a second sort of inner ring of members who made some declaration that they, along your lines, then you could, if you had occasion to, and if you knew about it, could investigate, find that they hadn't lived up to the code of conduct and exclude them. You've got to have something to exclude them from.
Well, I think, to be honest, I think what would work better is that we investigate it, write it up, you report on it. Because basically, as a consultant, the most critical thing in my business is reputation. And the brand is critical. If we got into the media as saying, the Economic Society has investigated this report by Richard Tooth and they decided it breached the code of conduct, that's me dead.
The most surprising part of your question was the fact that you believed that there were consequences for not following your code of conduct, because I've not seen that in the Commonwealth. At least I've not seen it. But again, to address it, it's not only could you investigate and do something. There has to be a standing requirement or process that people would expect you to investigate and do something about it, without, of course, offending the defamation laws, which are and you'd have some partial privilege, which may or may not be enough. I'm not a lawyer, but it's not that you could do it. You would have to do it. You'd have to set up a mechanism to do it. So you're really setting up a.
You may have to set up a thing that says if you sign, then you accept that we have the right to investigate
Yes.
you and publish our findings.
Yes.
That's a very good point.
Yes.
I mean, by the way, I think using the law as an example, there are cases where, you know, a judge has expressed opinion that the person providing the evidence is not independent, you know, and not unbiased, and that is incredibly damaging.
But
Those people do not
You
get-
can't sue judges for defamation in the
Yes,
exercise
no,
of it.
but the reputational effects are huge.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh
No,
yeah.
what he's saying is there are occasions when even judges
Yes.
have said, don't trust this guy.
And that's it, pretty much the end of
It's
the career as consultants, you know.
Well, it's a big issue in the courts, and they're trying to work out how to get witnesses that are not prejudicial to either the applicant or the respondent.
Gigi Foster, University of New South Wales. I just want to maybe take a step back and go back to the comment that Tony made about wanting more economists to weigh in on current policy debates. And of course, Flavio does try to do that a lot. I'm wondering the extent to which you think that this, and actually this also picks up on the diagram, we saw the U-shaped diagram of, you know, very, very strong disagreement and very, very strong agreement on the very same point. It seems to me that we've gotten, there's been a scarcity in recent years compared to maybe, say, 40, 50 years ago in the prevalence of economists who are actually willing and able to approach kind of a wide variety of policy issues and offer an informed opinion based on a basic view of the way that the world works, which is reasonably realistic and or checked against reality. We have a lot of specialization in our profession now. And, you know, some of it is highly technical, and some of it is very usefully technical. But because of the hours required to specialize so much in order to get the career kudos that, you know, everybody wants, the hours are necessarily taken away from being more au fait with, you know, generally what is going on in my society and, you know, what is roughly how things work, even if it can't be explicitly modeled in a technical sense yet, because we don't have the tools yet. Do you agree with that assessment that there's a relationship there between the specialization and the ability for economists to comment reasonably uniformly and unanimously, maybe not completely, but at least somewhat in agreement on a wide variety of issues in the public? And secondly, if you think that is a problem, then is there something we could do about it as a profession?
I'm happy to go.
Go.
So I do very much agree, but I think it's more around specialisation and understanding the issue. When I do see comment in the media, or see other economists comment in the media, often I do get concerned because on the issues that I know an awful lot around, it's usually that once you go digging into the issue, I mean, this is the nature of economics, is that, you know, it's fun because it's anti-intuitive, you know. Usually there's a much deeper, they haven't grasped the full problem. And it's not lack of technical capability, it's a lack of fully understanding the full implications of the issue.
Can I just make a comment about the panel, because I'm involved? So I think, to be fair, I think that divergency partially reflects views of, you know, things, but also the way the questions are asked.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that, to give an example, the question is asked this time around is, does for-profit provision of health and education leads to bad outcomes? I mean, I don't remember this, but it's too, you know, I can't agree.
Sweeping.
Yeah, that cannot, a statement like that, by definition, cannot be always true, by definition, right? And so I get, but some people will read it in a different way.
But then you won't strongly
No,
agree or strongly disagree with it.
No, I will say, you know, that can't be right? And so, in fact, I know lots of examples where, well, where no, your GPs actually make money, right? It's a for-profit, and by and large, they work really well, okay? Outside Australia, we have the example of the vocational system in Australia was a disaster. And in fact, just a little bit of advertising. The next section we'll be talking about that. But you know, I'm in my own home country in Brazil, where the public sector, you know, there's so many problems with public sector. There's a for-profit private education, and by and large, from kindergarten to, I mean, not university, but from kindergarten to year 12, and by and large, they do okay. They do good stuff, right? So it can't be true. So I think partially, but people take it as, oh, it has to be the vocational system in Australia. Therefore, I strongly agree. You know, so it's partially how the way but I think, in addition to the specialization, which you're absolutely right, there's some areas in economics now where maybe there are, you know, when I write a paper, I'm exaggerating slightly, but maybe 25 people around the whole globe will be able to read it. I mean, I'm not saying they're going to read it, you know, they'll be able to. So there's a bit of that. And also stuff that we talked about, and I'm sure we did too, the two of us, is the incentives somehow within academia are very, very skewed towards academic papers. And I'm not sure, you know, and we know, as we're good economists, you know, we know that incentives can lead you to corner, you know, and corner solutions. We also know from economics that usually they're not great, right? Corner solutions are usually never the answer, right? We know that from insurance, you know, from a whole heap of. So I think that's kind of partially the problem as well, and how we pull back from that. But let me just finish my statement saying that if you look at the top people in the US, the people I sort of talk to anyway, academics, they are pretty much involved in policy, right? And in fact, I go a bit beyond that. Their research is driven by policy, right? I mean, it's not immediate if you don't know that their research is driven by policy, but it is driven by policy, right? At least in my area. So I think, you know, we shouldn't be too harsh on academics. They're responding to incentives. Yes, we should sort of think about changing them. But I think, honestly, like I said before, economics is in as a discipline, intellectually, is in a great shape. But somehow, you know, it's a disaster zone when we go and apply that economics. But sorry, we have a question there.
Yes, Glyn Whitwer, Centre of Policy Studies. I've got one question, which is following on from something Ross wrote a few weeks ago, which is rather excellent, on the state of the profession, the state of journal articles as a means of promotion and so on. Is it ever ethical to write an anonymous review of a journal submission? Now, I think groupthink and objectivity get confounded a little bit. So I'll leave that for you to think about. And I've heard a couple of references to CGE modelling. Well, as far as I'm concerned, whenever you do CGE modelling, you must spend a lot of time explaining your results in terms of a data, theory and underlying assumptions. That is standard fare at the Centre of Policy Studies. So I won't let you off too lightly if you're too dismissive of CGE modelling. We can take it up later.
Does anyone want to?
Look, is the output of an anonymous paper worth it? That's, I think, the way I would try to approach your question, and I would probably say anonymity reduces its value, so the paper has to be very self-standing.
No, it's not the paper, it's the referees of the paper.
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, yes, I understand the question. Yes. Anonymous referees are awful.
Well, I mean, this is anyway. Yeah. All right.
Sorry, Mark Jennings from Department of Social Services. I'm just wondering if the contestability of claims in economics is one of those things that makes it a bit different from some of the other professions that currently have codes of conduct, and also whether that just limits the amount of things that a code of conduct might be able to cover?
You could say it's a social science, it doesn't have the precision of a physical science, and therefore there's more contestability. That's probably true, but I have a feeling that if I was some kind nuclear physicist and I proposed my latest paper, there'd be a hell of a lot of people who wanted to argue about it, even in a physical science.
Have a look at the psychology literature around well-being. Holy smokes.
The last time I looked at a contestable argument was about the whitewater and saltwater views about the government's role in inflating a debt economy. And Paul Krugel said that he couldn't argue against the whitewater economists opposing Keynesian interaction because they had no evidence to oppose. And so maybe contestability does relate to the evidence that is available to back up a case or to contest a case. You can do it with evidence. But doctors will have arguments about health issues and how to treat health issues, and I don't think those arguments should be overlooked.
I think exactly. I mean, I think what you're talking about is fully spelling out what, and it may well be that, often there isn't a right answer.
Rebecca McCallum from the Treasury. I am wondering to what extent part of the issue here is that, as I think someone mentioned, kind of everyone thinks they're an economist. So I know that in Treasury we see it as incredibly valuable to employ people from a whole range of disciplines, but fundamentally we're trying to solve economic problems. Now, some of those people will get some training in economics, but ultimately we have a lot of people who are sort of commenting on economic principles who aren't necessarily economists. And to what extent where people are engaging in comment in the media or providing input into these reports and they're not actually trained economists, can we, I guess, deal with those issues through a code of conduct?
Yes.
It's a bit hard for economists to impose a code of conduct on non-economists.
And I guess problem, what is, to your question, what is an economist really? And how do you define competence? Ultimately, I find most economic issues boil down to a few elements of competence, which is, as long as you, and then it's really just getting more technically strong.
It's interesting because I actually think the other problem's bigger, the problem of an economist giving an opinion in an area where they don't fully comprehend all of the factors. And we're just talking about for-profit hospitals, would they be better than public hospitals? The issues involved in that question are enormous. The factors involved in that question are enormous, and a trained economist can't really answer them without actually knowing a lot about hospitals and hospital behaviour and the like. So I'd worry more about that problem than the other.
Although I must say that if I worked in a department where there were a lot of bankers making decisions who thought that being a banker meant that they knew as much economics as they needed to know, I'd find that pretty frustrating.
Sorry, I think then you, yep.
Brendan Markey-Taylor from the University of Queensland. Look, I'm very willing to sign up to a code of conduct, but I don't work in a consulting firm, and after I've signed up for that, there is no way in hell that I would try and go work in consulting, because of the central problem here I see is, and how do we get around that it's extremely hard to argue with somebody who's paying your income?
We don't have that problem, literally. I've sort of had that problem, say, a couple of times where someone said, but we want the number bigger. And I said, no, well, we're independent. And I said, but we want the number bigger. And it says, well, can't you do this? Can't you make this assumption? And you just push back, and it was a horrible conversation. Most of the time, they want independent, objective advice. Now, perhaps there's a lot of selection bias there in they probably don't go into my firm if they want independent, if they want something else.
Yeah, I think that's
Yes,
it.
but then that gets back to the issue that I raised, and that is, are they asking the consultant for private advice for their own edification, or are they seeking what amounts to a PR document?
Yes, that's right. If they want an answer that doesn't come out of your work, I don't know what to do. I've never been faced with that, and I've made sure I've never been faced with it, and that's what you said. But not everybody wants a consultant to provide the advice that they want. So, I mean, a lot of people want a consultant to provide the advice that the consultant thinks is right.
Oh, that's only the sensible ones.
But there is a lot of it. I mean, and there's a role for consultants. If I were a manager of a company and I had to fire 300, 400 people out of 600, it would be very tempting to get a consultant to tell me to fire 300 out of 600 because it's not me doing it, it's the consultant doing it. But then the consultant probably doesn't have to sign on it. You know, this is done under the code of ethics and the like. But mostly people, well, I don't know about mostly, but sometimes they ask a consultant for their advice because they actually want it.
I think, by the way, there is we get a biased view when we look into the media as to what the consultants do. Most of the work we do doesn't go into the media, and most of the time it's kind of on advice where they do want, independent, objective advice. And that probably tends to be fairly boring, and so it doesn't make it to the media.
Hi, I'm Martin O'Connor from the Department of Employment. I've read that there's sort of evidence that the mere fact of studying economics at an undergraduate level makes people kind of more selfish, less cooperative, have less empathy. Is there, in your opinion, space for ethics to be introduced, actual discussion of what ethics is at an undergraduate level in the way that it is for psychology undergraduates, for instance? I mean, the evidence comes from studies by psychologists, of course, who we know aren't self-interested. But but do you think that, in the way that other social sciences actually introduce ethics from a kind of philosophical point of view, that would subvert some of these issues further down the line?
Look, I just briefly, because I do, in fact, I'm about to start next week my first class back. And the first thing I do is I have a first conversation is about ethics. But this is because it's a project-based course where students have to write a project, write a report on, last year was on value capture, right? And so I want them to appreciate, and I have lots of examples. For example, Harry Johnson convincing Milton Friedman to work for the Chilean government, and if you know a little bit about that sort of political history, it was a very, very brutal regime, killed lots of people, including Americans, right? And so, how is that? So we ask these questions. I mean, now, is that going to make them less selfish? I don't know. But, you guys,
It's interesting, and I've taken great comfort of the fact that the IMF and the World Bank and OECD have seen a link between income distribution and economic growth. The better, the more fairer, the more equal the distribution, the better the growth. Because for many, many years, economists were told that this was not their realm. They weren't to talk about social cohesion and stuff like that, even though that was so important in an economy. The first thing we have is a society. We don't have an economy. So I'm very pleased to see this intrusion of economics into social issues that might help you overcome. But then again, I know many economists who decide to get married on economic grounds.
And of course, the CIA torture program was developed and designed by psychologists. So
Yes, and lawyers.
I'm Marilyn McDowell from QUT. Going back to the panel, I think that probably the only real, from a lot of the questions I've seen, the only real economics answer is maybe. Not strongly agree, strongly disagree. And panel members, as far as I know, can make comments about their answers, and often that's what they're saying. If you mean this, yes, but if you mean that, no. And the other thing about the comments is that's when you can do spot the neoliberal. etc. And I think that's the kind of transparency would be nice, rather than someone getting into the media and saying, this is how it is from an economics perspective. I'm an economist, I know. It would be nice if it said, I'm an economist who has no time for government intervention. I'm an economist who, that kind of thing. And I think that is part of that importance of the transparency from an ethical point of view.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's not really a question.
Economists, as you were saying, are not in good humour with the public. They're not. I remember a treasurer, admittedly short-lived treasurer, who described economic waste as a bus load of economists going over a cliff that's only half full.
Treasury economist.
Treasury economist is correct. And we always read in the press, we would read it once every 3 months. You put 3 economists in a room and you get 5 answers, that kind of stuff. And so it's an issue of great importance to economists that their views, even when published, are going to be dismissed, or can so easily be dismissed by readers and the public, and that we need to do something about that.
I'm a bit more worried about the fact that economists might sort of say that they have a leaning towards government intervention or not government intervention. To my mind, if they're doing that already and they're positioning themselves on that already, then they're not doing what we should be doing as economists.
Well, yes, I know. But you can come from either side of that, as long as you're not right down one end or the other. You can be on either side of the middle and still judge cases on their merits.
I do struggle with that. There are a number of economists where I know that if I sat down with them in a room and we talked through issues, we would always come to the same type of analyses. We would disagree perhaps on a judgment about various parameters. Basically, it comes down to we come to say, well, that's an empirical question. But I think that's where I think if you start from an ideological position where you're lost already.
That's an interesting question itself. What is ideological? If my ideology about regulation is that I like governments regulating in areas where I and many others have no sound way of making decisions, then you could call that an ideology.
Yeah.
But I call that sensible. That if I don't know whether this cured meat's going to kill me or not, I would like to have a regulatory regime which gives me some assurance that if I eat it, I don't say in my last breath, I'm going to sue you.
I think that ideology means that you have formed views about how the world works and or how the world should work. Now, I think if you get to your middle years and you haven't come to some fairly firm conclusions, what have you been doing with your life?
And that's where I really worry. This is, I think, this is, to my mind, one of the biggest problems we have. Because I think is that if we have got firm views, then we're in trouble.
No, I don't think. I think what they're saying, maybe it's cross-purpose here. I think what they're saying is, look, for example, I know the case for privatization, for example, right? So there's if it's in a competitive market, most economists will agree, but for example, I have had these conversations with colleagues, so I can say from experience that for me, the reasons for, say, favoring privatization in industries where the government has no role, so it's just a legacy issue, is my argument is totally not based on economics. It's based on my understanding, my personal experience in public policy and with government organizations, that public ownership of that business just creates distractions for the government, who has to be in the business of doing what governments do rather than running a business, right? Now, that's a non-economics, but the argument that privatization have to be looked at, so even, I'll use my colleague's name because I'm sure he's not here, but John Quiggin, right? So he's a good friend of mine. We've written many papers together. He has a firm view. I don't think it's going to be, no surprise to you that he has a firm view on anti-privatization, right?
privatisation.
Yeah, he's against privatization. He thinks everything, and I'm sure they answered that question because he wrote that question, and so I'm sure he will say yes. The question about for-profit health and education, because he has kind of a particular. But that doesn't diminish him as an economist in my eyes, because every argument I have with him is based on logic, right? And at the end, you have some views that we form through different, I have different experience from John. I have experience outside Australia that John hasn't had with governments, for example, owning business, that kind of colored my view of how. So I don't think that's ideology. I don't see this as ideology. I think it's life experience, really, right? But anyway.
Well, what is ideology?
Yeah,
People always use it as a swear word, but I must say I think I have my own ideology, and I don't feel guilty about it.
Ideology can be tested, like the ideology that the lower the state consumes resources, the lower the growth rate, which I presume is the ideology controlling people who keep on talking about cutting government spending based on a percentage of GDP. We are already one of the lowest spenders in the world as an Australian government at the 3 levels, and they want to cut more. And I have this ideology that governments actually do have a role to promote distribution of money and distribution of wealth, and that's better for society. Now that end bit, better for society, of course, is not necessarily an economic issue, although I think it ought to be. As we're reading today, maybe it shouldn't be the CPI that dominates the Reserve Bank's policy. Maybe it should be income growth that drives it. And of course, we've had abominable income growth for several years now.
By the way, I think this raises an important point, is that ultimately one thing we do need to have a personal judgment about is effectively what is that objective. And, I think broadly the objective of pretty much every advice that I give is something around improving the well-being of the community. But you can narrow down on that, and I'm sure we're going to have different perspectives as to what is the community, what do we really mean by well-being.
Do we mean economic well-being or some much broader concept?
And I sort of think, I think the Carol Graham version of well-being, she was the keynote on the first day. Yep. So I think, but once we've got that, and I'm sure we might disagree on that. If it's not that, then it comes back to experience, which is, to my mind, really the parameter values.
No, true. Sorry, we have. No? Okay.
Hey, Preston Semsteros, UTAS. I just wanted to ask you whether you see any unintended and adverse consequences as a result of implementing an ethical code in economics. Perhaps it might stifle public discourse within among economists. Might encourage, it changes the incentives, so it makes work more internal and less communicable. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's such an extremely good question, and I fear that pretty much there's always unintended consequences almost anything we do, and the mere fact that they're...
Is that part of your ideology?
That's an opinion based on experience. Yes, it is an awful worry, and part of the reason why we have a discussion like this. And please, if you can think of further unintended consequences, and I've already forgotten the list that you've prepared, send them in.
Yes,
there are bound to be unintended consequences. Once we start with code of conduct, then we've got to talk about policing the code of conduct. Then we've got to talk about excluding people from the code of conduct. We're talking about building up another regulator in some senses of the word, which may not be welcomed by many economists. So yes, once you start off the step, there are going to be lots and lots of consequences, not all of which will be seen as welcome.
There is plenty of examples of voluntary codes among particular industries where and the logic behind them is to say, well, I'm a plumber, he's a plumber, but I'm part of the master plumbers and they've got a code of conduct that I'm sort of sworn to uphold, and I've got that logo plastered on the side of my truck, and I hope it's going to get me more customers.
Look, I have time for one more question because we do have another session that I'm involved in, so I have the right incentives to wrap up. So, sorry, last question.
Yeah, Jackson White here from the Young Street Initiative, a think tank which is trying to call itself independent at this point. A big issue in modern science is what they're calling the reproducibility crisis at the moment. So is that something you can see this sort of code of conduct be a move towards getting around these issues where people make huge assumptions where when doing modelling to the point where they can actually, a researcher can distribute code that we can actually check the specific assumptions as they're being made?
My experience, there is that happening in academia. My experience is that it tends not to be so much the code, it's more the transparency around the assumptions. And so it doesn't tend to be as detailed. The bigger issues I usually come across are, wow, it's just how did they make that assumption? Why did they exclude that alternative base case? Why have they just, you can make anything look good by comparing it to something worse. That's the classic, you know. True. You can make anything look good as long as you bundle it, anything bad look good as long as you bundle it with a whole bunch of other things which are really good, which offset it. That happens all the time. Those things aren't detailed code.
Cool. Look, can I ask you to join me in thanking the panel for a really good discussion?